All right, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's live training for hiking Q&A. As always, I'll do a quick introduction for myself. My name is Rowan Smith. I'm the founder of Summit Strength, and essentially what we're talking about today is training for hiking. And essentially what I do all day, every day is helping hikers and mountaineers with their training to get fit, strong, and resilient for their adventures. Now, essentially, the plan of attack for today is this is an open Q&A call, essentially where anyone who's watching live can plug in their questions into the chat, and I'm more than happy to help them. On top of that, I also do have a few questions that have been sent through previously to that or have come up this week, which I'm going to cover in a bit of detail. In between questions, and once we're sort of through all of that, then I will be working through a little bit of open course creation, where I'll be giving you an inside look into me putting together a course around breathing for hikers, and specifically putting a course around what we call respiratory muscle training for hikers, which I think is a really, really interesting subject for a lot of hikers. Now, I run these Q&As every twice a week, and I'm going to be doing this for the next 6 months at least. And I run them on Tuesdays and Fridays, 11:30 to 12:30 on Sydney time. So, with that being said, anyone watching in this live, if you ever do have any questions, feel free to plug it into the chat. I'm happy to sort of talk through things as we go through. But with that being said, let's, while we're waiting if anything else comes through, let's kind of have a chat about the questions I've been sent through already. And essentially, we've got two questions, talking about sore neck and shoulders for pack hiking, and talking about what we call optimal training for hiking. So sore necks and shoulders when pack hiking. This is a really, really common issue that a lot of people get out on the trail. And it's something that we work with a lot of hikers to help with. Essentially, the typical question I get around this and what has come up this week is, I go out and I pack hike. I carry a day pack or a full pack or whatever it may be, and I always seem to get a sore neck and shoulders. What can I do? This is a really, really, really common situation because, logically, wearing a pack while we're exercising is going to lead to this. There's going to be more pressure through the chest, more pressure through the shoulders, whether it's a day pack, whether it's a full pack, or anything in between, because we're always going to be carrying extra pounds, extra kilos, or whatever it may be. You can simply just put extra pressure on there. Now, if we just do this for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, doesn't really matter for a lot of people. It's usually not that big a deal. But if we start doing this on our hikes, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours, multiple days in a row, or whatever it may be, this can lead to a little bit of muscle soreness. Now, if you're doing a day hike, this is bad enough because, you can get sore during the day hike and sort of deal with it as you go through. You may get sore the days after and wake up in the morning like, my neck's really tight. This could even affect your sleep. You might go to bed and just toss and turn, and every time you turn, you're like, oh my gosh, my neck or my shoulders are so uncomfortable. Not much fun. On multi-day hikes, this can get even worse because if you're waking up in the morning on a multi-day hike and your neck's crimped or your shoulders are all upset, not much fun. And it can really, really just take a lot of the enjoyment out of these hikes, and it can be a little bit stressful. So I want to talk you through some really, really, really simple things you can be doing as a hiker, which can take a bit of pressure out of the neck and the shoulders, help you feel a bit more comfortable and help you get through these adventures a little bit happier. So essentially, we're just going to talk through 3 simple areas. We're going to talk through equipment, training, and on-trail tips. Now, first and foremost, the first place you should always look when it comes down to this is your backpack. This is the simple, basic stuff, but it does need to be said. First and foremost, is your pack fitted to your body? Have you just bought the pack and just wear it, you didn't really know how to adjust it, or have you actually gone through and adjusted the straps and make sure it fits your body properly? On top of that is if you got your pack fit 6 months ago, 12 months ago, whatever it may be, when's the last time you actually went through and readjusted it? Because straps do come loose and things change. First and foremost, you should be getting the right pack fit because this can make such a massive difference to making sure the weight sits correctly and it's not too uncomfortable. So if you know how to do this, make sure it's all fit properly, make sure it's all sorted. If you don't know how to do this, option number 1 is you can quite often go down to a local gear store if you have access to one of those, bring your pack down and say, hey, can you give me a bit of help with this? Quite often people will help you there. Alternatively, if you don't have access to one of those or you're not comfortable with something like that, You can look up tons of tutorials online and just say, how do I get the right pack fit? Make sure it's all in line. Now, this also goes hand in hand with making sure you load your pack up correctly, because if you've got all your weight in weird positions, not quite sitting properly, may add to it as well. So make sure you're covering that. Now, number two, and this, it is kind of common sense for a lot of people, but I tell you what, this is one of the biggest things that I often see from people they just forget about. If you are doing training with a pack, if you're hiking with a pack, or whatever it may be, please, please, please make sure you are doing this with a pack which has a hip belt. And not just a little hip belt, but a proper hip belt. Because a lot of hikers will go out there and they'll just wear any old backpack when they're hiking, if they're training. They're just going out with a day pack. And while this is fine going day to day, a normal backpack without a hip belt will rest all the weight on your chest and your shoulders. It will be uncomfortable. They're not really designed to hold a huge amount of weight. On top of that is if you are going out and you're intentionally loading up your pack, you're trying to do training hikes, or if you're actually going out on adventures and you don't have a pack which properly sits that weight, again, you're kind of like, really shooting yourself in the foot in a sense. So make sure if you are doing any loaded pack work that you at the very least have some type of hip belt and hopefully have a pack which has a robust hip belt. Now, on top of that, please make sure that whatever pack you're using, that you're kind of sitting within the weight limits. Because we often see people in two different situations where this can trip you up. Number one is if someone is building up to a heavy pack hike and they're going through their loaded pack training sessions, and bit by bit by bit, they're increasing their pack weight. And the first few weeks, it kind of goes okay. And then it comes a point where all of a sudden I'm getting this chest and shoulder pain. And this will often happen when we get to this point, when we're around about maybe 7, 8 kilos in our pack and we're using a day pack. And this might be, if you are in pounds, that's like 15 pounds or something like that. But either way, day packs themselves will typically have a bit of a range where they kind of top out on how much weight they can comfortably carry. And technically you may be able to carry that weight, but it's probably not designed for it. So if you are intentionally building up your pack weight, if you're getting that point, and at some stage you're planning on transitioning from a day pack to a full pack, maybe transition to that full pack sooner rather than later, because that will better hold the weight. Now, the other situation here is when people often go down the ultra lightweight route. And again, they kind of get their pack weights a little bit out of whack, because ultra light packs are great. They're really, really light and this and that, but many of them are just not designed in a way to hold excessive weight or hold heavy weight. So if you're intentionally loading up this pack for training, trying to get a little bit heavier, it may end up going over the weight limits. So just do a little bit of research, see what pack you have and see what the rough weight limits are. And if you feel like you're going over them, maybe consider a bit of a different pack. So equipment, pretty straightforward, pretty basic, but does need to be set. Now, on the training side of things, we essentially want to be looking at, okay, if we are struggling with pain or discomfort in the neck and shoulders, building up strength, building up endurance, building up resilience through these areas in our training can go a long way to prevent this. Essentially, 3 areas we want to be looking at with our training in this particular subject are strength, mobility, and also specific exposure. So essentially strength. A lot of hikers, when they're doing their training, they'll focus on the legs. They'll do lots of quads, lots of hamstrings, lots of glutes, which is great. But a lot of hikers end up completely neglecting their upper body. And while hikers don't need to be doing a huge amount of upper body training in their week, doing a small amount is pretty important. And it can make a bit of a difference on this type of situation. It can build up the muscles, improve their resilience, improve their tolerance, so it can handle these forces a little bit better. Now, if you are looking at, hold on a second, I'm going to close my window. Now, if you are looking at a upper body strength for your hiking, typically what we want to be looking at, as with all of our training, we want to get a nice balance between the front and the back of the body. We want to get a balance between making sure all the muscles in the upper body are getting worked in one way or another. And an easy way to sort of look at this is balancing out what we call pushing exercises and pulling exercises. So essentially, pushing exercises are exactly what they sound like. Pushing a weight away from you or pushing a weight straight above your head. Those are pushing exercises. Pulling exercises are, again, the same. Pulling a weight towards you or pulling a weight from above towards you, either vertically or horizontally. So we want to kind of get a nice balance of that. So to give you a few exercise examples of what I typically get my hikers doing. First and foremost, I'll get all my hikers doing some type of pressing motion. So this is an example of a pressing exercise called a floor press. Very, very accessible for a lot of hikers. You can do this at home. You don't really need any equipment. You need to use dumbbells or even a loaded pack with this. The idea behind this exercise is working chest, the fronts of the shoulders, a little bit of the backs of the arms. Literally all we're doing is just straight down, straight up. Very, very simple. Now you can do this off the floor, very, very simple. You can do this off a bench and make it increase the range of motion a little bit. You could even replace this with a push-up. It's pretty much the same thing as a push-up in regards to muscles work. Now, you may be wondering, okay, why are his hands pointed like that? If I've done this in the gym before, maybe I have my hands pointed the other way, like parallel. I quite like this neutral grip because it can be quite nice on the shoulder for a lot of people. Also can be quite nice for specifically for trekking poles. Some people like when they're trekking poles, certain muscles can get sore. This is a nice starting point for a lot of people. So this is sort of the first thing. Most hikers, I should say, will be doing something like this once in a week somewhere. Now, as we sort of said before, we typically want to balance this out with something for the back of the body. So a second option is doing something like a 3-point row, which is basically involved leaning on a chair or a bench or something like that. And all we're doing is basically pulling the weight up, little squeeze, and then coming down. Now, the intention behind this is working a bit of the biceps, but predominantly the upper back, and we're working through here. Again, you can use a backpack in this demonstration. You can use a dumbbell. It's a very, very versatile exercise. So both of these movements, they are what's called horizontal exercises. This one is a horizontal pushing exercise because you're literally pushing in a horizontal movement. And this one is a horizontal pulling exercise because you're pulling horizontally. And that can work out pretty well. Now, if a hiker is sort of just doing a couple of strength workouts in a week, in all honesty, you could do one of these on one day, one of these on the other day, and then the rest of your training end up doing legs and core and all of that. It works out pretty well. Now, if you did want to add in a little bit more, then you may consider doing some vertical stuff. So basically, this is an example of a vertical pushing movement where we've basically got a dumbbell, or again, you can do this with a pack, and you're literally just pushing it straight above your head. This one's predominantly working the shoulders, maybe a little bit of the triceps, and this is what we call a vertical pushing movement. Very, very simple. And then the third one, the last one, I should say, okay, to balance all of this out, we've got a horizontal pushing movement, a horizontal pulling movement, a vertical pushing movement. Then we want to balance it out with a vertical pulling movement. So this particular one is an example. This is my video. This is Coach Josh. Josh Wood. He's awesome. Check him out. Follow his stuff on Instagram. He's really, really good. But basically, this is an example of a vertical pulling movement. This one can be a little bit tricky to set up if you're doing it at home. This is an option where you can kind of get a band and you can like attach it to something up here, or you can loop it around a door frame or something. And basically what you're doing is pulling down and coming up, and pulling down and coming up. And this can be a vertical movement. If you're in a gym, you can kind of use like a pull down machine. They're typically a little bit better, or a table machine where you're pulling weights down, or you could even do pull-ups or assisted pull-ups or something like that. But that works out pretty well. So on the strengthening side of things, for this specific thing, if we build up strength through the upper body, that can be beneficial. So I would typically either do 2, 3, 4 of these exercises in the week, depending on what you want. You don't really need to do loads and loads and loads of this, but you're getting some exposure. Now, number 2 is mobility. So we're talking about strengthening. Another aspect that can kind of go into this is sometimes if we're very, very tight across the chest and the shoulders, we're very, very restricted and we feel like those muscles are really, really tight. This can lead to but making that soreness a little bit more uncomfortable. So doing a little bit of mobility work, a little bit of stretching work can be quite nice. So to give you a few examples of here, realistically, any stretch which stretches your shoulders or your chest can work out pretty well. This is one I quite like for this particular situation. It's basically called a single arm doorway slide. So what you're doing is you're basically finding like a doorway and you're lining up your shoulder here, shoulder back and down, elbow against the wall. And what we're going to do is we're going to lean a little bit of weight into it. And then all we're going to do is basically just slowly push the arm up and down. Like you'll probably notice there's probably going to be a bit of a stretch in the front of the shoulders, a bit of a stretch in the chest. This can work out pretty well. And we're essentially just trying to go up and down, up and down, up and down. On top of that, as we're going through, we're just trying to make sure we're not taking too much tension in the neck, which is quite often something people will do, but basically keep this nice and relaxed in the neck. So this is an option. You can also do this with 2 arms and basically have one arm here and one arm on the other side of the doorway and do both arms at a time. That works out pretty well. But realistically, anything that is going to be stretching the front of the shoulders and the chest can work pretty well. Also, anything that's going to be stretching the lats as well can also be quite nice and clean. And what I would typically do is I would usually load in my mobility stuff as part of my strength workouts. And I like to use my mobility stuff in my rest periods. So I'd do a strength exercise, and instead of resting and sitting around doing nothing, I would do a bit of mobility so you can make good use of that time. And then next up is exposure. Typically, when we deal with aches and pains, one of the best things we can do is take the thing that actually causes that ache and pain and then slowly expose the body to it in a controlled way. So we can slowly expose it to it so it can get a little bit more comfortable, it can adapt, it can deal with it and be a little bit happier. So in this particular situation, if we're aware that, okay, I get a sore neck and shoulders when I carry a pack while I'm hiking, there's two ways that I quite like to go about this exposure. Number one is doing loaded pack walking. So this is simply doing anywhere from 20 to 60 minutes, putting on a pack, walking around the local neighborhood, walking around a park, or even walking on the treadmill. The intention behind this is we start off with a reasonable amount of weight, something that doesn't cause us pain, doesn't cause us discomfort, and week by week by week, we make it a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. The idea behind this is because this walk is a little bit shorter, it is a little bit quicker, it's a little bit like more, you're not in the middle of nowhere, you can probably use a little bit more weight than you may use on your hiking because you're doing shorter. So you can expose the body, and you can expose the neck and the shoulders to this type of stress in a short period so it can be a bit more comfortable. So that's number one. Number two is with our hiking, if we're aware, okay, I get a sore neck and shoulders when I hike, when I carry a pack, ask yourself, okay, what weight typically triggers this? Is it 4 kilos, 5 kilos, 6 kilos, 7 kilos, whatever it may be? Then what I would recommend is basically just stripping back your pack weight a little bit. If you're aware that at 5 kilos I typically get uncomfortable, pull back your pack weight to maybe 3 kilos. Do that for a couple of weeks while you build up the exposure through those shorter, more controlled works, and then slowly but surely build up. And if we can do both of these things, the shorter, slightly heavier pack walks, and then the hiking, and build them both up gradually at the same time, this can work out really well. And then finally, just to cover a few on-trail tips. So specific things you can kind of do for your hiking if this is all going on. Now, number one, a little bit of a warm-up. A couple of quick stretches before hiking can go a long way. Typically, just releasing the chest, the shoulders, doing like that slide if you can at the trailhead, if there's like a pole or something, even just doing like a chest stretch and just leaning against a car or a tree and you've got your arm up against it and you're leaning in and just stretching that out for like 2 or 3 minutes before you start going. Sometimes that's enough for people to kind of feel a bit more comfortable. The second technique, which can be quite useful, is aiming for belly breathing or diaphragmatic breathing while we are hiking. So a little bit of thought goes behind this is essentially one tendency for a lot of people when we are a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit tired, and we're getting like, working relatively hard while hiking. Essentially what can sometimes happen is we end up breathing through our chest and our neck, which is sort of, just a way people breathe when we're working hard. And what ends up happening is we're breathing through our chest and our neck and we're doing, and we're kind of up and down while we're breathing. If we are carrying a pack, this can end up us doing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of little repetitions because we've got the pack on our neck, we've got the pack across our shoulders, and we're just doing little repetition, little repetition, little repetition. This type of thing is not a big deal day to day, like it's not going to be the end of the world day to day, but it does show up if we're carrying a pack. So one thing that can take a little bit of pressure out of this area is as you are hiking along, really, really concentrating on, okay, when I'm breathing in, I'm going to feel my belly expand. I'm going to breathe in deep, feel my belly expand, and try to keep not too much movement through the chest and the shoulders. Now, this particular breathing technique, diaphragmatic breathing or belly breathing, is a really effective and efficient method of breathing. It's something that a lot of hikers, I would sort of say, should aim for anyway. But in this specific context, it can take pressure out of here. It can help those areas be a little bit more relaxed. Can be really good. Next up is use of water bottle trick. This is specifically for people who are going through this training process and slowly trying to load up and expose the body to it with your hiking or your loaded pack walking. What I typically recommend is if you are doing this and you're intentionally loading up your pack, make sure at least 50% of your pack weight is made up in water bottles. And when you go out on your hike or when you go out and walk for as long as you can until you start to feel that discomfort, until you start to feel that pain. And once you do start feeling that, as opposed to just pushing through and dealing with it, take some water and dump it out. And maybe even dump out all your water except your actual drinking water. Now, I personally really like this because as opposed to you getting uncomfortable and just pushing and pushing and pushing, and then you end up with a really sore neck at the end, this gives you a little bit of variation. This can actually give you the opportunity to expose the body to heavier pack weights and challenge yourself slightly, but also just do it in a way which isn't going to overload things too much. And then finally, just stretch as needed. If you are hiking and going along and that's getting uncomfortable, take a moment here and there, do some stretches. Do a little bit of self-management, stretch out the chest, stretch out the neck, do some little neck stretches, stretch out the back, or whatever it is, and just doing little bits and pieces of that through the day, it can go a long way. So when it comes down to it, getting a sore neck and shoulders while pack hiking, it's pretty common. A lot of people deal with it. Definitely make sure you're on top of your equipment. Definitely make sure you're doing some things in your training to help build up your resilience, your tolerance to this. And when you're on the trail, hopefully there's a few tips which can make a bit of a difference there. So with that being said, hopefully that kind of helps a few people and hopefully that makes sense. I think it is sort of a topic that does come up quite a bit. And I think, a lot of this stuff, like, with the pack fit and everything, people know this stuff already, but the amount of hikers that I speak to who surface level, they're like, I know that. Like, that makes sense. I know having a pack fit is right. But then when we ask you, okay, when was the last time you actually readjusted your pack? And they're like, oh, it was like 12 months ago or 14 months ago or whatever it may be. So hopefully having all of that in one place can be so useful for a few people and can make a little bit of difference. So next up, I want to talk a little bit about optimal training. And this is a funny subject that sort of comes up a bit. So optimal training for hikers. The inspiration behind this particular subject is I often get people asking me, sort of saying, hey, I was online and I heard this coach or this influencer telling people they should be doing this with their training, telling people, they should be focusing on this or incorporating this and it's the best thing you can be doing or whatever it may be. Or on the flip side, someone's like, hey, you should be avoiding this. If you're training for hiking, you shouldn't be going out and playing sports. If you're training for hiking, you shouldn't go out and be doing, circuit training or HIIT training, whatever it may be, and all of that. And then people will sort of say, hey, I saw someone saying this, or maybe you saw me saying this. Is that true? What's the deal with it, or whatever it may be? And I think the whole core concept of this particular situation comes down to the whole idea around optimal training. Because in the coaching and the fitness world, many people love to talk about what is optimal. They'll talk about all of these different things what you can do with your training, with your nutrition, with your sleep, with your recovery, with your gear. And, in the hiking context, gear, you'll see so many gear videos saying, hey, you should be doing this because it'll save you 200 grams, or you should be doing this because it does X, Y, and Z, or you should be wearing these shoes because it does whatever it may be. Or you'll listen to podcasts and they'll talk about recovery and they'll say, hey, you need to be doing these, saunas or cold plunges, or you need to be wearing these compression boots or whatever it may be. And there's just so much content around optimal, which is all well and good. And, there's obviously a lot of hyperbole in the fitness industry. And sometimes people are talking a little bit too much, but sometimes this stuff is good. It's legitimate. It makes sense. And there's evidence to back it up. But in all honesty, sometimes this type of stuff can get a little bit overwhelming. Sometimes there's just completely conflicting information. You may sort of watch my content, someone else's, and you may see Rowan says do this and concentrate on this, but I read this book and this person was saying do this, or whatever it may be. Or sometimes it can be in this situation where you're just like, oh my gosh, I should be doing this and this and this and this and this, and you're just worrying you're not doing enough to get yourself in the right position for your adventures. And you're thinking, I'm putting all this time and attention and money even into my training and my actual adventures I'm going out, but maybe I'm not doing enough to get me where I need to be. Can be a little bit tricky. So realistically, when it comes down to it, and this isn't the only way to go about this, but I want to talk you through what my lens is and my philosophy is around this. Is personally, I'm a big believer in what I call practical versus optimal. In the sense that if you were an elite athlete, and say you were training for the Olympics, or say you're a professional athlete, where you go into a competition and you're in a race or you're in a match, whatever it may be, and every second difference or every moment could literally be the difference between success and failure. It could be the difference between you winning a race and losing a race. It could be the difference between you winning a match or losing a match. It could be the difference between you actually having a payday if you're a professional athlete and being absolutely broke the next day or whatever it may be. Yeah, in those situations, you want to be chasing this optimal side of things because this is your life. This is your main priority. This is exactly what you want to do. So you want to be chasing the best thing you can do. This may also fall into the situation if you're maybe an extreme alpine climber, where you're like, hey, you know what, literally, the difference between, this could be the difference between safety and death, in all honesty, or whatever it may be. So in these situations, going down this optimal route does make sense. In all honesty, the 99.9% hikers out there, in all honesty, this is just not necessary. Like going down this full optimal route where it may conflict with your life, it may conflict with your schedule, it may stress you out, it may end up taking over your life, whatever it may be, it can be a little bit tricky. So to put this into context and sort of give you a visual on how this looks, I think a cool way of looking at this is the whole concept around point of diminishing returns. And I think this is an economic thing. I'm not 100% sure where it comes from, so don't quote me on this, but I like this graph and the whole concept of it. So the point of diminishing returns is pretty straightforward. On this graph, we've got output, so the actual results you're getting, and the input, the actual things you're doing to get those results. There is a period where basically you start doing more things, you have more input, you start doing training, you start applying nutrition, you start focusing on certain areas, and you see really, really, really good returns. It accelerates quickly, you see more improvements, your fitness is getting stronger, your strength is getting stronger, yada, 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 yada. Then it hits this point where basically you're not at your maximal potential of improvement. You're not at your maximal potential of, seeing improvements in strength or fitness, whatever it may be. But it hits this point where your returns and your improvements begin to slow down. So you begin to do more and more and more, but it's this point of diminishing returns in the sense that things slow down. So you keep on doing more, but it's not quite as quick as before, which makes sense. And it keeps on going up and up and up very, very slowly, and then it begins to peter off. And essentially gets to this point where if you just keep on doing more and more and more, instead of you actually improving, you start going the other way and you start going backwards. And this is like when you're overtraining or when you're sort of doing way too much and it's compromising other things or whatever it may be. So I think this whole concept is really kind of good to keep in mind or give you a bit of a visual, because realistically, for everything that I recommend for the hiking community, or at least 95% of what I recommend for the hiking and the mountaineering community, what I'm striving to do is essentially get people to this point here, in the sense that we do everything we can to get you the best results in the quickest amount of time and the best results from the least amount of effort. And then that's kind of where we end up. So we're going to practical, we're going to this point of diminishing returns. And then yes, there's probably more things you could be doing and more things you could add and more things you could change. But it's like, well, does that effort, that requirement, that time investment, that intensity, whatever it may be, does that justify what's coming back? I personally believe for most hikers, and what I try to base my training philosophies is kind of get you to this point. Each individual, we may throw certain things in, which may add into this, and we may say, hey, we want to do something which maybe takes a little bit more time, maybe it's a little bit more annoying, or whatever it may be, and we sort of creep in there. But it's not like that's what I talk about with everyone. So to put this in a little bit of context, let's sort of talk about this and we'll break it down to like strength and cardio and even your hiking pack and make it simple. Now, on the increasing return side of things, on the cardio, realistically, to see the easiest results and the best results and the quickest results, if a hiker follows a structured and specific cardio plan, which progresses around over time and fits around your schedule, that is really, really effective. So when I say structured, it means you have planned sessions which are created in a way which makes sense. It's not just random cardio session. Specific means it's specific for you as an individual. It's specific for your occupation and sport, so it's working on the right elements of fitness. And progresses over time in the sense that it follows the principle of progressive overload. It gets a little bit harder, a little bit harder, a little bit harder, a little bit more each week. And that, in my personal opinion, is going to get you up to these increasing returns. Now, if we're going to go into the diminishing returns, then we can sort of look at, okay, realistically, we can probably see a lot more improvements in the world of hiking if we end up dedicating hours and hours and hours of work to zone 2 stuff. So zone 2 training is like low intensity casual training. And in all honesty, a lot of hikers could probably see more results if they ended up doing 2 hours of gentle stationary cycling or gentle walking every single day. And we could probably see some extra results. But in all honesty, for a lot of people, the time investment for the results you're getting out of that, I don't know, is it worth it? Some people may be worth it. Not everyone will. So realistically, what I say is, yes, we definitely want to do some zone 2, but it's not, you don't often see me saying, hey, you should be doing 10 hours of this each week or whatever it may be. Some coaches say that, I don't. And then we kind of come into the other end of things is negative returns. On the cardio side of things, maybe some people are like, hey, you could be doing 20 hours of cardio each week. You could literally every single day just be doing more and more and more and more. And it probably gets to the point where you're overtraining and that starts going back a bit different. This is kind of the context and the view that I sort of take things. Hopefully it's kind of making sense. On the strength side of things, and this is a funny one because a lot of people, they'll sort of come, there's a lot of different approaches to strength. And for how I approach it, I'm a big advocate in the hiking community. And the structure I put around strength training may be more structured than what a lot of people are doing. But also on top of that, it may be a lot simpler than what a lot of people have done in the past. So on the strength training, I think, in regards to getting this point diminishing returns, just following a well-rounded, structured, progressive program with a simple rep scheme is really good for a lot of hikers. So what I mean by that is well-rounded, meaning it's working the body as a whole, the lower body, upper body, the front of the body, the back of the body, covering everything. Structured in the sense it's not just random exercises, but you actually have proper workouts. And progressive, over time, gets reapplied progressive overload. And simple rep schemes might be a case of saying, hey, on this one exercise, you're going to do 4 sets of 8 repetitions. That's pretty simple. That's pretty basic and this and that. I think for most hikers, that's going to get you to this point. But if we did want to keep on moving forward, there are other ways of going about strength training. We can follow different rep schemes or progression schemes out there. There's 1,000,001 different approaches to strength training. We can get a little bit more complicated and maybe squeeze out some more results. So for example, if we wanted to really, really lock this up and say, all right, I've got more time to invest. I don't mind spending a lot of time in the gym. An example of this might be doing something like wave loading. So instead of just doing 4 sets of 8 reps, and that's pretty simple, you might do your first set at 6 repetitions. Then you adjust your weight, you add more, and you do 3 repetitions the next set. Then you adjust your weight, you add more, you do 1 repetition. Then you adjust your weight again, you go back to 6, and then 3, and then 1. And each set you end up adjusting your weight. Now, technically, that can be a really good method of strength training. That can actually get you some really, really good results. But I would sort of say it falls in, at least in the hiking context, into this diminishing returns. It's a lot of effort to do all those sets. It's a lot of effort to change your weights each phase to do that properly. And it's a lot of intensity you need to work out probably sitting there. Would some hikers be worthwhile doing that? Yeah. Would most hikers? Probably not. And then we can sort of go into negative returns. There's a lot of information out there, which, is just strength training is just crazy. And a lot of people out there will try to train strength like a bodybuilder or a powerlifter. And the tricky thing is, if you don't know what you're talking about, it can be hard, or don't know what you're looking into, it can be hard to identify the advice for bodybuilders and powerlifters, which is kind of okay, and the advice for bodybuilders and powerlifters, which is actually created for bodybuilders or powerlifters who are on steroids. If you're not a part of that community, you might not know that a lot of people who put together training plans or have certain methods, they created for people with steroids, or they were on steroids when they created it. So there's a bit of a mismatch between people. So if a normal hiker tried to do this type of thing, it probably falls into the other side of things. An example of this is something called German volume training, where literally you do 10 sets, 10 repetitions of an exercise, which is madness and crazy. And for some people in the bodybuilding and powerlifting community, that may be effective, but for hikers, not so much, and that definitely falls in the negative. Now, last example of this before I kind of wrap this up is, on your pack. I personally think the simplest thing a hiker can do to really get themselves in a good spot with a pack, get a pack that fits, reduce unnecessary weight. Very, very simple. That will get you to a really good point. Then if you want to take it a little bit step further, you can kind of go down the ultra lightweight gear, and you're like, okay, well, I'm going to invest in a more expensive pack, a lot more expensive tent, more expensive sleeping mat, all of that. And we can probably eke out some extra benefits. Won't be as good as just getting that initial pack fit, but, extra work. And then taking it on the extra side of things, like on the point of diminishing returns, is if you just take that too far. And if you start like going, okay, I'm reducing my pack weight, but all of a sudden now I am restricting my food. I'm only bringing the bare minimum of food and water as opposed to enough food to properly fuel me. And then, we'll end up, we'll be lighter, but it'll probably affect us negatively. I think this is just a nice way to illustrate kind of the grand scheme of things. And I would sort of say pretty much 95% of what I talk about in my content is aimed at this point of diminishing returns. This is what I believe and what I'm striving for with my strategies and my structures to kind of get us here. There'll probably be like 5% of stuff that I occasionally talk about publicly, which may end up being in here. And sometimes I'll talk about different methods of training and that, which will eke out a little bit more. But I feel like when I talk about this, I usually say, hey, Focus on the basics. That'll get you where you want. And this is just sort of something extra we throw in. So if you are ever looking at like, okay, why is Rowan saying this and then someone else is saying that? This may very much be what we're talking about. I personally believe practical over optimal, and that's kind of what I'm striving for in all of my systems, all of my structures, and all the ways that I approach things. And I'll sort of just say as the final thing with this, if you are ever looking at something and you're like, I don't know, where does that fall in the scheme of things? Like, should I be doing this? Should I not? Whatever it may be, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to chat and just give you a bit of context, whether or not it should be worthwhile for you filling in. So feel free to reach out in our community group, feel free to reach out by email or whatever it may be. I'm always happy to chat on that front. So hopefully that gives people a little bit of insight into kind of this whole idea around practical versus optimal. I think this is an interesting concept to kind of keep in mind. I won't say I'm perfect. I won't say everyone gets to this exactly because everyone's different. There's so many individual circumstances and from that. But that's kind of the first principle I would sort of say that I'm trying to keep in mind as we go through. So yeah, with that being said, as I am chatting through, if there's anyone in the live who does want to have any questions they want covered, feel free to pop in the chat. I'm always happy to talk through things. But I guess with all that being said, what have we got? We've got about 25 minutes now. So yeah, those are the questions I wanted to cover. So now let's talk a little bit about the course creation. So if you haven't seen this before, what I'm actively doing in these calls is basically I'm just doing a little bit of open course creation on a new course around breathing training for hikers. And specifically what I'm talking about in this course is going to be what's called respiratory muscle training, which is essentially strength training for breathing. So it's in the sense that if you go to the gym, if you want to strength train, you hold some dumbbells, you apply load to your muscles to increase the strength of your muscles. That's strength training. Respiratory muscle training is pretty much that for your breathing muscles. In a particular way, we apply load to our breathing muscles to force them to adapt, to change, to get stronger, which can therefore help us a little bit more in certain situations. So what we're doing here is a little bit of open course creation. Now, the course at this stage, fairly early days, it is a little bit of a mess. And essentially the way that I kind of go about putting these things together is I just kind of, just over time, just put together a bunch of sort of topics that I want to cover. And then I just slowly build them out in a random order. It's not very logical, this and that, but the first 75% of the course, I just build out what kind of comes to mind. And then as we get towards the end, then we start trimming things out. Like, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't need to be there. Or maybe there's a gap here we need to kind of fill. And we start sort of like making a little bit more built out. So what I want to cover today, and I think we should have time, is just a little bit of detail around my background and principles of this, and also respiratory muscle training. And I tapped out a little bit of this before. So realistically, when it comes down to this course, and I think, this is going to be covered very, very easy early on in the course, is I feel like I need to be really, really clear around my background here, where I'm coming from with all of this. In the sense that a lot of people out there, like, talk about breathing training and often position themselves as like these experts and these specialists and this and that. But when you look at them, it's like, yeah, they may have done some courses and this and that, but they may be a specialist in the technical sense, but do they really have that kind of deep knowledge? I don't know. From my perspective, with all of this and how I'm approaching this, I'm definitely not a breathing specialist. I'm not a breathing expert. I'm not claiming to be this, whatever it may be. My speciality is strength and conditioning for hikers and mountaineers, which breathing training could be a small subset of that. That is not my speciality. Essentially, my background in all of this is, I have a background in sport and exercise science, in the sense that I went to university, got a degree in sport and exercise science, however many years ago. I've got over 15 years experience in the fitness industry in one way, shape, form, or another. In the breathing context, I've read books, I've watched videos, and worked through certifications and done courses around this. And I use breathing training in different contexts with my clients. Some people may have particular needs or particular trips coming up or whatever it may be. And we'll often talk about some breathing strategies and concepts or whatever it may be. But even with all of this, this doesn't make me a specialist or an expert. Even though I've done certifications, even though I've done courses, I've got some cool knowledge, I'm definitely not a specialist or an expert. I know out there are so many more people who are smarter than me. Way, way smarter. People who have a much deeper scientific understanding. Like, I understand certain layers of this, but there's people who have deeper layer after layer after layer, that deeper scientific understanding. As much as I went to university for sport and exercise science, I'm not a sports scientist. I don't work in that space. This isn't my bread and butter. Strength and conditioning is. So I know there's people smarter there, and I know there are breath specialists who are actively working in this area, who've been working in this area for a decade and this and that, and with deep knowledge and deep experience in this and that. But the tricky thing is when we're coming into the hiking context is we don't really see information from these people. Because these people are working in different areas. They may be working in a clinical setting, they may be working in studying setting, they may be working in different sports or something, because hiking and mountaineering, I would sort of say it's a high money sport or something like that. We don't really see information about people in this context. And we definitely do not see it in the hiking context. There are people out there and there's coaches and there's courses and this and that who talk about breathing training for hikers and mountaineers. I don't know. It can sometimes be a bit hit and miss depending on what they're doing. But one thing I will also say is no one seems to be talking about this respiratory muscle training, or at least talking about it in a way that makes sense when you actually look into it, a way that kind of has evidence to support it, whatever it may be. Because I personally believe from the learning I've done, the courses I've done, the reading I've done, and this and that, I personally believe that this respiratory muscle training is a really interesting area for hikers and mountaineers. It's definitely not sort of main priority. It's definitely not sort of saying, hey, this is not something everyone needs to be doing. But I do believe it's a very interesting area that people can explore. And I also believe that this respiratory muscle training, if done in the right way, which is effective and have evidence to prove it, could be potentially more beneficial than many of the breathing strategies which often get talked about in the hiking community. And obviously there's a million and one breathing strategies out there for different reasons and different situations, but use the example of breath hold training. That's getting more and more popular in the hiking community. People sort of say, hey, do this breath hold training, do this apnea training, do this simulation of high altitude training, which is another name for it, and this will give you all these crazy results. The evidence of that, there's a few question marks around what's commonly claimed, but I feel like respiratory muscle training, again, if done right, can potentially be way more beneficial than this. And I personally believe that because no one else is really talking about this, at least in the hiking community, I believe that at least I have the basic knowledge to present this in a basic way. I'm not going to sort of say that I'm have the deepest knowledge here or personally coach people with all of this or whatever it may be, but I feel like I have the basic knowledge to present this well enough. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with this course. So this is literally that spiel that I just talked through. This is going to be very early in the course. It may even be before people sign up, just to give people context on it. So I feel like that is really important. And I feel like a lot of people position themselves as these specialists. But, are they? I don't know. And I'm definitely not claiming to be a specialist. So hopefully people come in with a little bit more, understand the context and can understand, have a bit more perspective there, I suppose. So that's background. We covered that. I don't think there's too much more we need to read to that. Next one is principles. So let's talk about this. And this is definitely something I want to kind of add a little bit more into. Because typically what I like to do is whenever I'm talking about a method of training, whether it's strength training, whether it's cardio training, whether it's hiking training, recovery training, or in this case, breathing training, I think it's really, really good to kind of start with first principles in the sense of just understanding the overarching principles that we need to understand around, is this going to be effective for me? And basically keep this top of mind. So not only while I'm going through this type of training, and I'm thinking, okay, is this going to be effective? But I can also use these principles to kind of judge other things. And I can sort of say, hey, someone told me to do this. Let's go back to those first principles. Does this all line up and make sense? So what I've got so far is realistically, not all breathing training is created equal. Like not all cardio is created equal. There's many different approaches to your cardio training, which will create different adaptations in the body for different situations. The same thing is not all breathing training is created equal. A lot of people just lump everything together, but it's not the same. And this is even more so for hikers, because in hikers, there's a million and one breathing techniques out there. How many of those are going to be effective for hikers in different situations? Maybe a good portion of them, maybe not so many. We've got to judge that for ourselves. I think the first principle we kind of want to keep in mind, and this is something pretty relevant, is specificity. In the sense that, is the breathing training you're doing, is that going to be specific what you're trying to improve? So this kind of is important to understand, because we can't just sort of say, hey, I want to improve my breathing, so I'm going to do all of these different breathing techniques and this and that. Because it's like throwing mud at a wall and it's kind of seeing what sticks. We kind of want to know, what am I actually trying to improve in my breathing? Am I trying to, I don't know, examples. Am I trying to increase respiratory muscle strength? Is that what I'm trying to do with this? Am I trying to increase CO2 CO2 tolerance? Is that what I'm trying to do? Am I trying to increase mental comfort when breathless? Am I trying to increase ability to maintain lower breathing? Am I trying to increase oxygenation? Am I trying to increase, I don't know, or decrease stress? Stress, anxiety. These are just a few examples, but we could sort of say like all of these are different outcomes in regards to different breathing techniques and different approaches. So when we're going into this type of thing, we kind of want to know, is what I'm doing going to improve that? Because if I'm a hiker and I'm going to high altitude and I'm like, you know what, I really struggle with breathlessness. I really struggle with catching my breath, and I'm worried about that high altitude. But I'm doing all my training, which is focused on this really relaxing and calm breathing when I'm at rest, and it's really, really good for de-stressing me and chilling me out. But then when I get on the mountain, I'm actually hiking, going up a hill, and I can't stick with that because it's just not practical to do when I'm moving. Was that really a specific technique for me? Maybe beneficial in certain situations, but we've got to sort of look at specificity. So I'll have to build that out a little bit more, but I think that's the first thing we need to cover. Now, kind of going hand in hand with that, then we got to sort of think about, okay, effective. So this is a funny one because the world of breathing training, the way that we judge effectiveness of something, typically in sports science, we say, hey, is a technique going to work for me? We go look up a bunch of research articles and see, is there evidence to support this? Is there evidence to sort of put a question mark on this? Is there so much evidence that we're like, well, in all honesty, it probably doesn't do this? In the world of breathing training, there isn't a huge amount of evidence out there. It's a relatively niche subject. It's a relatively sort of area that not a huge amount of research goes into. On top of that, most of the research, or a lot of the research, goes to medical, I don't know if it's the right word, but people who actually have breathing limitations, be it different to a healthy population. On top of that, then the research that goes to people who are actively doing sports, more sort of elite athletes like cyclists or whatever it may be, a little bit different to hiking. So it gets a little bit convoluted here. But what we're trying to look at here is we want to look at any technique or any approach we're doing and just ask ourselves, is this breathing training we're going to do is going to be effective or was it going to be? So we're going to sort of ask ourselves, is there some evidence available? If possible, are there some research papers that kind of show, hey, there is potential here. This can actually improve things. Or if there's just not enough research on the subject, is it at least logical? Or are there massive breaks in logic which may disprove this, or not disprove this, but put a big question mark on it? The sort of example here we can use, if we can sort of say, okay, this course we're talking about respiratory muscle training. Now, improving the strength of our breathing muscles, specifically the muscles responsible for inhalation. Now, when we look at this, there's a reasonable amount of evidence on this to sort of show, okay, good evidence to show we can increase this if we load up the muscles with, I think it's like 30 to 50% of 1 RM. Which basically means, there's evidence to show that if we can load up the breathing muscles with a significant amount of load, and I'll explain all this in a bit more detail later, but with a significant amount of load, there seems to be quite a few research articles out there and a good body of evidence to show if we do this, this can be pretty effective. But then we also see there's evidence to show that when loaded up with 15% of 1 RM, not huge benefits. So there's also quite a bit of evidence to show that, okay, when people have loaded up their breathing muscles and they've done 15% above 1 repetition maximum. So 1 repetition maximum is literally the one breath in we could do with the amount of load on it. We could literally only do 1 because it's so much stress on our breathing muscles. And then essentially 30%, 50%, 15%. Now 15% of a 1 RM, if we did that with a breathing device, we can still feel a bit of resistance. We can still feel like, yeah, that's actually tough. Like it takes a little bit of stress. But there's a reasonable amount of evidence to show that even if we're loading up with that amount of resistance, and it feels like it's stressful, it's not actually enough to show good improvements. And we kind of like, the evidence is showing around 30, 50%. And again, we'll go into that later. So then we have to sort of ask ourselves, okay, there's people who often claim things like one nostril breathing. Got to sort of say, okay, some people sort of say, hey, close one nostril, breathe in really, really quick. That's going to increase your respiratory muscle strength. And you're like, well, you do this and it applies a little bit of resistance. But then if I go and get a device and I try 15% for the 1RM, which is kind of proven, or at least believed to be proven, that it's not enough resistance to see effective improvements, and that feels significantly harder than this. And then if you try this and you're like, oh my gosh, that's way harder. And we're like, well, does it really line up? So this is kind of what I mean. Like, if someone is claiming a technique will do something, we need to sort of look and say, hey, is this at least effective? Or is there evidence to suggest, or at least logical to effective? So we kind of need to keep that top of mind. And we can use that for so many different things. We can use that for what we're talking about in this context. We can use that about breath hold training. We can use that about nose breathing. We can use that about Wim Hof breathing, all of this different stuff. You can kind of ask, is it effective? Is there evidence to show that it improves certain things? We need to look at that. Next up, I think we need to talk about time efficiency. And I would say, like, this is maybe not a first principle, but maybe a second principle, but I think it needs to be said. Because realistically, in the grand scheme of things, and one thing, yeah, it is a first principle, because like a lot of people should keep this top of mind. When we're diving into the world of breathing training for hiking, it can be an interesting area of improving our performance and our comfort while hiking in certain ways. However, we need to keep top of mind that breathing training is always, always, always going to be considered an accessory method of training, in the sense that the basics of training, our cardio, our hiking, our strength training, these are the foundational blocks of our training. This is where it's going to give us 95, 98% of our results. Accessory training is something that we do on top of that, which will sort of eke out some extra results. So as I was talking about before in this thing where we talk about that rate of diminishing returns, this breathing training, or at least this respiratory muscle training, it would fall into that second step of, like, you know, the rate of diminishing. You're adding extra input, it'll see some benefits, but it's definitely not going to be the main thing. We need to keep that top of mind, because quite often we'll go down this rabbit hole and we'll be like, hey, I'm doing breathing training, but it ends up taking away hours of my week. I'm spending all this time doing this, and actually, I'm not doing my other stuff. Or maybe, like I saw someone online instead of saying, hey, they swap their breathing training, swap their cardio for breathing training, which is obviously just clickbait. But it's just, you know, it just doesn't make sense. It's always going to be breathing an accessory. So we want to think about breathing training. It should be time efficient. It should be doing it in a way that doesn't take up too much of your time, doesn't get in the way of your training, doesn't sort of take up a huge amount of time. Now, one of the reasons I quite like is respiratory muscle training. Let's sort of say RMT with a device is basically, the prescription for this is 6 minutes a day. 3 minutes in the morning, 3 minutes evening for 6 weeks. That's very, very time efficient. That's kind of what we're talking about here. Alternatively, RMT with a mask, we can sort of say, so if you've got one of those elevation masks, in quotation marks, like the mask you put on and this and that, there you can kind of improve respiratory muscle strength to a certain degree, and it can be beneficial in certain situations, but we're probably going to be doing 30-minute plus sessions of exercise at a time, multiple times a week, or something like that. I've got to sort of dig into the exact numbers of what the prescription of that is, but you can kind of see this is very, very time efficient. This maybe not so, or whatever it may be. We're going to keep that on top of mind. And then I think another first principle we need to keep in mind is, like, not compromise on other training, in the sense that, again, those foundational breathing methods, we do our strength training to get stronger. That is what we are trying to improve with our strength training. We do our cardio training to improve certain adaptations in the body, to improve our cardiovascular fitness. That's what we're doing. Now, there are some breathing techniques, and there are a lot of breathing techniques, which are basically you need to do, which are part of your training sessions. So, for example, let's say breath hold training. There's a lot of people who do that. Well, one of the prescriptions for that is doing it during interval training. You'll do intervals, you'll hold your breath, and away you go. The tricky thing here is that may be effective as a breathing session, but that's going to then compromise the original intention of your session, because you're not going to be able to work at the right level or the right intensity or with the right amount of energy to actively move your cardiovascular fitness as forward as well as it can. So we just got to think about, okay, improving our breathing is good, but we want to make sure it's not cannibalizing our other sessions. We kind of want to keep that top of mind. And yeah, there may be sort of situations where we may say, okay, we do want to do this breathing during a session because that is the main reason I'm doing this session, to get this out of there. But we want to make sure, again, we're not cannibalizing things, because this breathing method is an accessory method of training. So there's got to be a little bit more in there. Specific, time efficient, not compromise any other training. I'll probably say safe. That's always a good one. Some breathing. Yeah, no, actually, this is a really good one. And it's not directly like in the hiking context, but like, it's a bit of a funny subject, but like the whole Wim Hof breathing. There's this whole thing that's going around. Okay, Wim Hof breathing, a lot of people do it. Is it relevant for hikers? Big question mark on that, but whatever. A lot of people love it for a bunch of reasons. And there's this whole thing where basically Wim Hof breathing paired with cold exposure, or cold exposure in the water, a lot of people do. And then there's this whole thing where a few people died, because there was just a dodgy situation. I'm doing it with the water and I got themselves in a situation. And obviously there's outliers, there's like certain situations, but we've got to keep in mind, is breathing training safe? So just safe for environment, mental, dizziness, health conditions. We got to sort of think about it in the hiking context. Yeah, environmental, away from water, not in the middle of nowhere, all risk. And I think we'll probably have to build that out. But yeah, we've obviously got to think about safety. Because if there's something that may give us some small percentages of increased improvements and some small percentages of improvements on the trail while hiking, that's cool. But if it also comes with this 1 to 2 or 3% of something severely going wrong, and say you're on a hike and you're doing a particular technique, and then you have this 2% chance of getting really dizzy and having a trip and fall and breaking a collarbone or something, is that something we really want to lean into? Is it safe? And I would sort of say there are some breathing techniques in certain situations we probably don't want to do, and there's a lot of breathing techniques which are perfectly safe. So why not go down that? I think that's definitely something to keep top of mind. It should be, people should understand that from the get-go. However, let's sort of say that and keep that top of mind. Say specific, time efficient, compromising training. Simple could be one. Let's say simple. In the sense that training and life can be complicated enough. We want to keep things as simple as we can. Breathing training should be a net positive. If it is causing stress and confusion, so we could probably look at that and sort of say simple, in the sense that one of the things that I have with my clients and my hikers is, so many people try really good complicated training programs, or so many people just have so much going on in their life, and just simply getting a routine of training and ticking things off can sometimes be hard enough. Realistically, just training in general, we kind of want to keep it as simple as we can. Obviously, there will be a level of complexity to kind of get the results that we want, but we want to kind of keep things as simple as we can. And again, going back to this graph, I think this kind of makes sense, in the sense that simplicity can get us a very, very, very good point. And then we keep on adding more and more complex things. Yeah, it may improve us, but is it really, really, really needed? So I think in this context, keeping things simple. If breathing training should be net positive to yourself, it should improve us, it shouldn't stress us out, whatever it may be. This is an accessory method of training. It's going to give us a small percentage of improvement. It's not going to be one of those big blocks of doing your cardio, doing your strength training, whatever it may be. So we want to keep things relatively simple. There are going to be, again, some elements of complexity that you probably have to do to get the best results from it, but you probably don't want to have spreadsheets and, do all these complicated things and just really stress yourself out. Probably needs to be said. So we'll probably pop that in. I think that'll probably do enough for the principles of breathing training. I was also going to go into what is respiratory muscle training. I'll probably build that out a little bit more next call. But realistically, what we're looking at, breathing muscles work hard during exercise. our breathing muscles, and specifically our inspiratory breathing muscles can fatigue during heavy exercise. This can lead to things just feeling harder. This can lead to less blood going to the working muscles, leading to fatigue. Pretty straightforward. That's kind of the rationale behind it. We'll definitely build that out quite a bit in future calls, but that'll probably just do us for time today. So that being said, hope anyone watching this live has enjoyed this. Hope anyone watching this in the future has enjoyed this. If anyone has any questions of all this, please let me know. As I said before, I will be doing these lives on Tuesdays and Fridays, 11:30 to 12:30 Sydney time, probably for the next 6 months, up until September at the very least. That's further than 6 months, so yeah. But either way, so anyone ever has any questions, follow-up questions on this, please let them know. But aside from that, hope you've enjoyed the chat. Hope you got a little bit out of it. Anyone needs to handle anything, reach out anytime. Have a lovely day. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you.